Welcome to Frankly Speaking. This is a new podcast on responsible business by Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howett, and after several years of debating these issues inside the European Parliament, I speak frankly and personally about what moves policymakers, business and activists to make responsible business the norm. Today, Frankly Speaking welcomes Théo Jaekel, Director of Business and Human Rights at Swedish-based telecoms giant Ericsson. A qualified lawyer, Théo became a specialist in business and human rights, which he's led at Ericsson for more than 3 years. Ericsson has been making telephones for almost 150 years and currently carries 40% of the world's mobile traffic through their networks. Théo Jaekel chairs the Sweden-China Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Business, serves on Frank Bold's own business advisory panel, and has had board roles with Transparency International and the United Nations Global Compact. Previously, he worked for 4 years undertaking corporate investigations and field studies, primarily in Southern Asia and Africa. He once said, "Corporate responsibility work is not just some sideline anymore, but rather it should be elevated to one of the central elements of a company's operations." Théo, welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you. Happy to be here today.
Great. Before we get into business and human rights and in Ericsson, can we just think in your life, go back to when you first came across these issues of business and human rights, and how did you first get into it?
So as you mentioned, I studied law. So my background as a lawyer, I specialized in human rights, but maybe the more kind of traditional type of human rights, the role of states, international criminal law, those types of issues. And back then when I studied law, the issue of private actors and private actors' responsibilities for human rights wasn't really a very developed legal field, or at least not in Sweden. So if you studied human rights law, it was more kind of thinking about working at multilateral institutions such as the UN. But then I started working at Transparency International, as you mentioned, and kind of more focused on compliance issues and the role of business in acting responsibly on a global market. And there I started to see the connection between corruption and impacts on human rights. And this was about during the same time when Professor John Ruggie was working on his framework and the UN Guiding Principles. So that kind of led me into looking into what the UN Guiding Principles were about and how you can connect those issues to business practices. And that has then led to my current career and roles in civil society, businesses, and law firms working on these issues.
And the late and wonderful John Ruggie, I think, had a huge influence on all of us, me as well as you, and many, many, many others.
Definitely.
On business and human rights at Ericsson, let's just start with some of the challenges specifically to you as a telecoms company, which many of us watch and are very interested in. I know we'll have a general interest out amongst the Frankly Speaking audience. Firstly, on the freedom of speech issues. You know, I remember the Arab Spring when the mobile phone companies were accused, not particularly Ericsson, by the way, of cutting off their services at the behest of governments which were operating repressively and trying to avoid protest and freedom of speech. And in recent years, we've seen countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, UAE, Qatar, who all have introduced laws on cybercrime, but many people say that they are about prohibiting freedom of speech in their countries. You're carrying these messages. How do you avoid undue state interference? How do you defend freedom of speech?
So, I mean, these issues are definitely at the core of the work that we do within Ericsson on business and human rights. Freedom of expression and right to privacy are one of, or among the salient human rights issues that we definitely address. And specifically then when we talk about the sales of our products, potential misuse, end use of our technology. And you mentioned the Arab Spring, and we've been working actually with our current human rights due diligence framework that we call the sensitive business framework at Ericsson Part of it was actually developed during that time, where we saw what was actually happening, how governments were misusing technology, and started to think about what is our role, how can we mitigate that, how can we prevent it, in dialogue with our customers through both kind of contractual mitigations, but also technical mitigations. How can we build in safeguards into our technology, for example? And this is a process that has evolved over the last 10 years, and also through the work that we now do within the Global Network Initiative, working with other industry peers, also operators that are our customers that are facing these types of requests in these high-risk markets. It is, of course, very worrying that we see a decline globally when it comes to democracy and these types of repressive regulation and legislation in some cases that makes it more difficult for responsible companies to operate in those types of markets. But I think at the same time, it's important when we talk to stakeholders on the ground, for example, that they are asking us not to disengage, but to stay, even though it is difficult, even though it is challenging, because companies such as us and other GNI members, we try to use our leverage and be part of those dialogues and trying to push the legislation in the right direction.
And you talked about end use, and I've certainly come across examples where industrial goods have been exported but have been used by countries to build armaments. And there's the famous case, of course, of chemicals companies exporting to the United States, but unbeknownst to them, it was the chemicals were being used for executions and the death penalty. And both of those became big issues. I think end use in relation to your technology, I'm less clear about. So what are the big risks in terms of end use, and how do you manage them?
So, of course, one clear issue is impacts on right to privacy, misuse of surveillance equipment, for example. Any network, the standards that we build our network in accordance to, which are agreed on an international level, need to include certain capabilities for law enforcement agencies to intercept communication. That's standard in any country. Of course, in a country where there are human rights protections, there are also limits to what the law enforcement can do with that type of technology. The risks and the main problems are when that type of technology is accessible in countries that lack human rights protections, or where law enforcement agencies have maybe very far-reaching authority to misuse. So what we can do in those situations is one is, as I said, limit the technical capability. So we can, for example, limit the number of interceptions that could be run on a network simultaneously. So in that way, kind of preventing some form of mass interception. All such requests are also logged, for example. So operators, ourselves, and law enforcement can go back and see, was this actually done in accordance with the legal framework on how requests are supposed to be filed? For example, was there a court order? But we can also limit through contractual obligations to make sure that a interception solution is only used for the intended purpose, and not by other agencies, for example, that shouldn't have access to it. So those are some of the examples that we try to implement in our contracts and in our dialogue with the customers.
Fascinating. I've also read your 5G human rights impact assessment. I have to say, a brilliant document. I recommend all our Frankly Speaking listeners have a look at it. And there's a whole section about the Internet of Things and the way that industry is changing rapidly now, moving away from wired uses, and all manufacturing will be using networks like your networks, and where data and the things ecosystem, that's a wonderful phrase, by the way, is going to be crucial. People are getting their heads around what that means for industry and for business, but specifically in terms of human rights, what does that mean? And again, how are you managing that?
Some of the issues that are relevant from the perspective of Internet of Things is one is, of course, the increase in the generated data in the networks. So with more and more connected devices, we're not any longer talking about just our computers and phones. It could be everything from our watch, our car, our refrigerator, our front door to our house is connected somehow. That, of course, generates more data, and that data can, of course, be used to paint a more accurate picture about behaviors, movements of people, how they are using devices, what kind of information they are accessing. And that could then, of course, potentially be misused for illegal or illicit surveillance purposes, for example. The other part of the issues that could be relevant when we talk about Internet of Things is, as you mentioned, of course, also industries. And what we talk about there in the report, which is, I think, very important to keep in mind now when we are rolling out 5G, is that if more and more industries are being connected, have access to that type of information, have their own networks, they could potentially also be facing requests from authorities to share certain data, share certain information. And they might not be as prepared as traditional kind of ICT companies to respond to such requests, to evaluate them, to ensure that there are protections for human rights. And there, I think, companies such as ourselves and other GNI members have an important role when we engage with those types of industry customers to also raise awareness, build capacity, and kind of transfer our knowledge from when we've been working with these issues and make sure that they are also prepared for these types of risks.
Indeed, one of the phrases used is that every company will become a technology company in the future, and that will face these challenges. Now, as you know, Frank Bold works on the European sustainability standards and also the forthcoming, and it's currently in discussion in Brussels, corporate sustainability due diligence directive. I know that you and Ericsson follow carefully all of the developments, but first, as a matter of principle, you come out and said you favour mandatory human rights due diligence for business. Why do you do that?
So yes, that's correct. I mean, we've been involved in this debate at the EU level for quite some time, and why we welcome this initiative from the EU Commission and support the need to have mandatory human rights due diligence requirements is, I mean, there are of course many reasons for why this is needed, but some of them are, of course, creating a level playing field. I mean, we see that today with voluntary principles, some companies choose to implement these principles, choose to act responsibly and to try to influence their business partners. But we know that the majority of companies do not. There is still, I mean, there have been a lot of studies by the European Union as well that demonstrate that the majority of companies don't have human rights due diligence processes in place. So there is clearly a need to raise the bar and make sure that there is a level playing field and not just a few companies who choose to act responsibly. The other issue is from a kind of corporate, a company perspective, is to avoid the situation that we have today, which is very much of a fragmented area of different frameworks. So avoid that fragmentation. As a global company for Ericsson, I mean, we have operations in over 180 countries globally. And if we have to adapt our frameworks, our reporting to the Australian legislation, to the UK legislation, to the EU legislation, to the US legislation, that becomes very burdensome and not very effective, because it's about just kind of tweaking language rather than creating impacts. So hopefully why we support this on the EU level is that will create this harmonization. It's for now only within the EU, but hopefully that could be a global standard, as we've seen with GDPR, for example. And of course, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say we've got the draft. Now, of course, sorry, I should say this. Yes, in Europe, but of course we know elements of due diligence legislation from California to Norway to Australia. Exactly. This does seem to be sweeping the world. On the draft in Europe, though, in particular, as I say, the Commission has presented its proposal. It's currently being debated by EU governments and by the European Parliament. What's your view about and any thoughts about the current draft that has been produced?
We think that it's important to align the directive with existing international standards, so the UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines. And to some extent, the directive does that. It uses the right language when talking about how what does due diligence mean? It means risk assessment, acting on those risks, tracking performance, and so on. But at the same time, there are some shortcomings, and some quite clear shortcomings if you compare it to the existing standards, such as the scope of companies that are affected, just also focusing on a few high-risk industries, which we know are not the only high-risk industries, how companies demonstrate compliance. So it's very focused on contractual obligations, cascading obligations to suppliers, audits, and to a large extent, many companies have moved away from that and have a more collaborative approach, and it's not just black and white. Also, the issue of the scope of due diligence versus the scope of liability, differentiating between that. So there are a lot of areas that I think the directive should be improved, and I think the main issue is don't create new definitions such as established business relationship. Use definitions and established principles such as severity, human rights risks, how due diligence is conducted, how you demonstrate that, because otherwise we will again have this fragmentation of an EU directive that says one thing, and then the international frameworks that still will exist and still have certain expectations of companies on the other hand.
And you use the word liability there. That's often one that gets companies worried. They're happy to deal with the principles, but when it comes to actually potentially being held to account legally or through judicial systems, clearly that can scare people. Do you think liability does have a role here, and why?
So we do. We've said that we acknowledge that any effective directive or legislation needs some form of liability or some form of enforcement. So it's important that that's included. From a company perspective, it's of course very important that liability becomes predictable in some way. So it's not a vague principle, and I think that's some of the voices from the corporate side that have been raised, is that it's unclear when a company would actually be liable, and is that scope too broad? And that's why I mentioned that the directive might potentially look at differentiating between what's the actual scope of due diligence, where we look at the full value chain and say you have actually a responsibility to conduct due diligence in your entire value chain. That, however, doesn't mean that you are liable for every single impact in your entire value chain. And I think there again, we can use principles and concepts from the UNGP, such as differentiating between when a company is causing or contributing to a human rights impact, or when a company is directly linked, and use maybe a similar principle when defining liability as well.
UNGPs being UN guiding principles, of course. What about climate? Many people argue that it shouldn't be human rights due diligence, but human rights and environmental due diligence. Are environmental issues also human rights issues? What do you say on that?
No, definitely, and I think that's also a good step that the EU Commission has included, that it's both environmental and human rights due diligence in the directive. Of course, remembering that maybe the methodologies might differ a little bit between when looking at environmental impacts and how you identify and mitigate an environmental impact and how you mitigate a human rights impact. But I mean, we've already had, of course, discussions, and I know many other companies as well, to try to break out from the silos that we've traditionally been working in, where we have an environmental team and a human rights team, but more working together. And I think this directive, if implemented correctly, could be a way of doing that, to start seeing environmental impacts and human rights impacts together. And one such area is learning from kind of just transition when we talk about energy, for example, and thinking about that, which we also raised in our 5G report, thinking about that from the perspective also of, for example, automation. So that will also need some kind of transition and a just transition, hopefully. So what does that mean for the workforce and so on? So yes, it's from an environmental perspective might be good with automation and more kind of effective industries and factories, but what's the social impact of it? So those types of issues, I think, will be more and more important to try to work together on, both within the company, but also externally.
Thank you for that. I think a lot of people listening would have agreed with almost everything that you've said today. But the business and human rights issues are tough, and they do produce some difficult choices. And I wanted to ask you on the fight against corruption. I think it's a problem in every country and for every company. But Ericsson have had some of your own questions about this, dating from as far back as 2007, and had a settlement in the US courts in 2019 over issues around bribery and corruption. I don't want to get into the detail of that, but I do want to ask you, what lessons have you learned from that episode?
No, so of course, I mean, that's a very sad part of our history that happened, and as you said, I mean, that has also led to the settlement and certain consequences for the company. But as you say, I think it's important to see what are the learnings from this, not just for us as a company, but for other companies as well. And since then, since the settlement, we have been very focused within the company to really establish kind of a world-class compliance program that works globally. And that's not just within the area of anti-bribery and corruption, but also covering issues such as occupational health and safety, our human rights commitments, the environmental commitments. So have kind of a global approach to responsible business practices, because of course, as I mentioned early on, there is a clear connection between corruption issues, human rights, and other responsible business areas. So it's of course a journey. I mean, we're still working on establishing parts of this compliance program, but I think it's a very important learning for us.
And what I hear from that is that the enhanced global approach is that there was stuff happening in your supply chain amongst business partners, amongst perhaps those whom you supply, and that you're getting a bit more aggressive, a bit more positive about saying, no, we've got these global principles with all your partners, wherever you are. You talked about 180 countries in which you operate. There's only 190 in the United Nations. How is it possible for you to have that level of knowledge and engagement and to be able to pursue these principles in such a broad and long supply chain?
I wouldn't claim to have a perfect visibility or knowledge about all of our risks or issues in our value chain. And I think that's not also what's expected of companies. I mean, of course, we have to prioritize, we have to focus on our salient issues, and that's part of one piece of the puzzle, is defining those salient issues, working on really understanding where do you need to focus, because you won't be able to deal with everything. But another part, kind of going back to the learning and this global compliance program, one way of also dealing with this, and what we've been very focused on, is not just establishing frameworks, but having also a cultural change within the company and raising awareness, because it will never work if it's just a global human rights team that works with these issues. We have to have people on the ground in these countries understanding what are the problems, when should they raise an issue with us, or even have the capacity to deal with them themselves. And also kind of shifting the understanding of these issues from, it's not something that prevents business. It's really something that is a foundation for doing business. And in the long term, I strongly believe, and I think many do with me, that it's a business enabler in the long term.
And that culture change is something, of course, the Shift Project, well known to you and I, who are the members from the former John Ruggie team who've created a centre of expertise on business and human rights. They've argued that culture change is as important as these contractual, black and white words, bits of paper changes that happen in the world of business and human rights. We'll have them on Frankly Speaking at some point. Thank you very much to Théo Jaekel. We've come to the end of our podcast, and I'd like to invite all of our audience to send us your feedback to franklyspeaking@frankbold.org and to share our conversation. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Watch out for our next episode and find out about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on Twitter and LinkedIn. See you all next time. Thanks again to Théo. Thanks to all our audience, and goodbye.